Hi, I'm Wojtek Gwiazda. I'm the spokesperson for the RCI Action Committee. And today we're welcoming Gaston Barban, who is a former Canadian ambassador and also a longtime diplomat with the Foreign Affairs Department. During the late 80s and the mid 90s, he was the liaison between the department and Radio-Canada International. First of all, I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Wojtek. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. And I think the first question I have for you is, in the late 80s, when you were doing liaison between Foreign Affairs and Radio-Canada International, what was the attitude of the Foreign Affairs Department towards the international service?
Well, in those years, and I wanted to contextualize things by saying that I was a mid-level officer at that time, but in working in the communications, what we call the Communications Bureau of the department. And at that time, RCI was seen as kind of like a partner to the work of the department, definitely with an international vocation, as the Department of, I guess in those days, it was the Department of External Affairs and International Trade. So we were in the same business. We were in the business of Canada's international relations. So there was that attitude towards RCI. And we saw it as a useful tool for Canada's diplomacy.
So it was recognized as an institution that could get the Canadian reality outside of Canada to different populations by the different languages, and also because it was programming that was made for an external audience.
Well, yes, that's true, and there was a recognition, and it was reaching parts of the world that we would call, I guess, closed societies. So by the use of shortwave, it was able to penetrate those closed societies. And the department was very much aware that it was being used in a targeted fashion to particular parts of the world. And of course, in the 80s, this is before the end of the Cold War, so a lot of the efforts were in Eastern Europe, but not only in Eastern Europe, but that was part of the recognition that the diplomats had that this was part of the East-West conflict, Cold War era.
When I talked to Alan Familian, who was a longtime program director at Radio-Canada International, he told me about the consultations with the Foreign Affairs Department, and I guess he dealt directly with you. But from what he told me, it was a consultation. RCI was not being told, you have to do this language, you have to do this. It was, perhaps you could describe how it was.
Well, in form, it really amounted to about a 2 or 3 hour meeting. Maybe 2 hours be more accurate. Usually and almost always in my experience at the Pearson Building in Ottawa on Sussex Drive, where Alan and one or two of his colleagues would be coming to Ottawa to discuss with a group of employees, external affairs employees that I would be inviting that represented different geographic regions of the world to sit down and discuss where RCI's efforts could best correlate with the national interests of Canada, the international interests of Canada. Now, that's what we had that meeting, but beforehand, of course, it's not that we cooked the meeting beforehand, but there was some to and fro beforehand where Alan would say, look, this is where our plans are for this year. These are our resources. And then I would say, from what I hear, the department is interested in these following regions. And it would come together in a draft memo that we would discuss at that meeting. And then once any disagreements were ironed out, we'd have a final memo which constituted, I guess, the consultation, the results of the consultation, and the kind of general direction that External Affairs was giving RCI as to what regions of the world and in which languages it would be useful that if RCI could turn its attention. So it was never you must. It would be helpful if you could.
And in terms of these consultations, These were between the Foreign Affairs Department, you and others, and Radio Canada International. CBC was not involved in this.
As far as I know, no, because keep in mind, it maybe sounded naive, or but the fact is that our minds, RCI is part of the CBC. So we just simply saw it as the international service of the CBC, and so. But I don't recall ever that a CBC official was with us. It was always Alan or Betty Zimmerman or people that they delegated to participate in these consultations.
What is the importance of, I'm going to ask, diplomacy and Radio Canada International? Because in a way, both of our roles are very similar. We want to create bridges between Canada and other people. Maybe you could tell us, well, we hear terms like soft diplomacy. Is that what RCI was in the view of the department? And give us a little bit of an idea of the kinds of considerations that the department would have in these kinds of issues.
Well, let me answer that by just making a distinction for our viewers about this issue of public diplomacy or soft power. And most people would say that traditional diplomacy is the diplomacy that takes place at the government level, state to state, where diplomats are sent out by their governments to interact with the foreign governments on behalf of their home government. And that most of the interactions take place at that government official level and are really not public, open relations. There's a whole other part of diplomatic activity called public diplomacy. And this is more about trying to reach foreign audiences beyond the governments with information about our country, in this case Canada. To try to reach to particular audiences in countries like media, like academia, like business people, to name a few, and reach them with information about our country. Why? Because we find, and people who've studied things like soft power, which some people have defined as the power to attract or the power to create a positive disposition towards oneself is soft power. So if you can create that kind of image of yourself as a country, it helps provide a foundation upon which other kinds of diplomatic exchanges can occur. So in the field of public diplomacy, we have a lot of different tools that we can employ. Everything from cultural tools, cultural diplomacy by sending Canadian performers, by promoting Canadian artists and books and musicians, or by performing, by sending like the Cirque du Soleil, to use an example, or sporting events, anything that can increase visibility and create a positive image of the country. So RCI was in that one of the arrows in that quiver. So the RCI was very targeted because it actually provided information about Canada in the language of the audience. And I need to say that again, in the language of the audience. So, and it's not just the language, but they also contextualized information about countries so that the target audience could actually understand, not only by hearing their own language, but also understanding in the context of their own culture, what it is that was being told them and what information was being imparted. So it was a very powerful tool for public diplomacy. And a lot of people got that. I mean, I would think that in the 80s and 90s, that this thing started to change. Maybe before that, there were more practitioners of the old school. But by the 80s and 90s, a lot of diplomats understood that effective diplomacy constituted diplomacy conducted in public, as well as the kind of traditional diplomacy. So as RCI withered, as it has unfortunately, we've begun to lose that particular tool, that particular arrow in our quiver. I'm sorry for that long answer. I hope that I've covered some ground.
No, that's, and you said withered. So I think for the general public, I'm not sure, except when there's a crisis and we're talking about RCI disappearing, most people aren't really aware what it is and perhaps don't even care. But what we found in the last 3 months in terms of the campaign since the CBC announcement on the 3rd of December is that within those who were foreign diplomats, who are foreign specialists, all of those people are very concerned because they realize the importance of contextualized reporting, contextualized programming, because yes, you can be an international broadcaster, as anybody can say, because now anyone in the world can get access through the internet to your material. But is it understandable? And I guess that was the thing that we did so well. But when you start cutting and cutting and cutting, and we're facing now having a world service with 9 people, that is certainly, using your words, withering RCI. How do you look at what's happened, and how do you look at this decision by the CBC to back off from focusing on external audiences?
Well, I find it unfortunate, and but there's 2 points I wanted to make in answering that question. One is we're talking about events, 30, 40 years ago, and a lot has happened, especially in the world of technology in the past 30, 40 years. And that's one of the factors that perhaps explains why there was a lack of attention to what was happening at RCI. And I'm referring specifically to the lessening importance of radio and shortwave radio for some parts of the world, and the ubiquitous nature of the internet now, and how information is more at people's fingertips than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. That's one element that it's worth analyzing if we were to analyze why this is happening. The other thing to look at is, of course, the whole Cold War thing, which I alluded to earlier. So like up to 89, there was a definite approach, and whether it was the Voice of America or the BBC World Service, a lot of the Western governments were targeting the former Soviet Union with programming, especially in Eastern Europe. And so that legacy of the Cold War, or that raison d'etre for a lot of these world services, kind of ended with 1989 and the fall of the wall in Berlin and the end of the USSR. Fortunately, or it's not the correct word, adverb to say fortunately, but what had happened was that we realized, of course, there are other closed societies, and of course, the Tiananmen Square was 1989, so there was still a realization there would be societies where the Western world, where democratic governments needed to reach into those societies with information about themselves, information about what's going on in the world, so that the people of those countries and those regions would have a better understanding about their place in the world and perhaps how they might improve it. So we keep those 2 factors in mind in trying to answer why did RCI wither, to use that verb again. Those are the main reasons, because people thought it was becoming irrelevant to the conduct of public diplomacy. I find this unfortunate because what I'm finding is that people are perhaps, and governments are not paying sufficient attention to providing the resources that are required for Canada to have an effective voice in the world. And it's not just having diplomats out of what's now called global affairs, sitting in embassies around the world and tweeting here and there and trying to promote programs on the internet. We need as many ways of reaching audiences as we can. And so the fact that the RCI is almost on the brink of disappearing is a very unfortunate thing, and it's a symptom of this lack of attention providing resources to our international relations.
I want to address your points there. The one about the Cold War was interesting because in 1991, when we lost half of the 14 languages that we had, most of them were Eastern European languages. And that was the justification. The Cold War is over. But what we were getting from the listeners in those countries was, no, we need you even more because we need to know how a democracy works. And so it was interesting to see what common sense seemed to be saying in those days and what actually were the needs of the audiences. And I think that's one of the reasons why RCI is so important, is because we were so well connected with those audiences that they would tell us, no, don't go away. We still need you there. And the other thing in terms of the internet, and I'm now kind of almost preaching to you and whoever's watching, is that we were on the internet at the same time as the CBC. And it was one of our quivers in terms of being able to reach our audiences. And I would argue that what's important is not the medium, whether it's shortwave, podcasts, streaming, you know, I've even joked in the past, carrier pigeons. The important thing is that you have contextualized information for that external audience so that it really is useful, whether you're in China, Ukraine, Brazil, Japan, Germany, wherever. And that was, in fact, I remember up until the cuts in 91, not only did we broadcast specifically in certain languages, but our English and French sections were subdivided into a section for Europe, a section for Africa, a section for Asia, and a section for for the Americas, with specific, you know, mandates to explain to those listeners. So, and I think that's again is a little bit like you as diplomats. You had telephones and internet and all kinds of ways of communicating, but the soul of it was you were diplomats and what you said and how you exchange information. And I've just made a speech, and you have, but I think you agree from your reactions.
Well, I do, because it is all about the contextualization of information, to use your phrase, because even as a diplomat, when you're asked to speak publicly, not even publicly, when you go in and speak to a counterpart, let's say in the foreign ministry, you're always contextualizing, because you cannot assume 100% understanding by your host of our country. You know, how do you explain you know, federalism and how a federal state works if your interlocutor is from a unitary state? You know, how do you explain transfer payments? So you can't even explain it to Canadians, let alone explain it to foreign governments. So you always are in this mode where you're trying to explain and make the country better understood. I think about, when you think about RCI, I think about the Canadian Studies program, another program that was cut over time, you know, which was a very powerful program in the 80s and 90s, which reached out and provided funding for professors in foreign countries that taught their students about Canada, Canadian history, Canadian literature, and so on. And these were Canadianists. They promoted the study of Canada abroad. And that was another way of trying to find people within the host countries that could explain our country to them. So that was another tool, another arrow in that quiver that we keep talking about, that was important for diplomats. That is almost gone now. It's also suffering from a lack of resources. Now we're talking about RCI, another tool that helps the diplomats and helps Canada's international presence and helps Canada explain itself to the world. As we lose these pieces, we become less understood and less known. And if they don't know us, how can they love us? You know, and so it's really important that we continue to promote and talk about ourselves and use all that's available to do so, but to do so in a concerted way, where we do it deliberately with an idea with who the audience is, and to deliver information and messages to them in a way that is understandable to them.
If you could, because as we're recording this, we're 29 days away from the end of the international mandate being the central focus of what RCI is. If you could say something to the Prime Minister and the ministers who could stop this, because what's being done is a violation of the Broadcasting Act. If you could tell them something, what would you say?
I would tell them that Radio Canada International is one of the elements that are essential for an effective Canadian foreign policy. It is an effective tool for promoting our interests internationally. And if it were to disappear, we would probably in the future have to reinvent it, because the requirement of reaching foreign audiences with information about our country in a language and with content that is understandable by them is the fundamental and essential nature of conducting international relations. And if we want to promote our prosperity and our security as a country, we need to be active on the world scene. We need to be understood and known on the world scene. And we need as many tools as we can to do that job. So I would say, Mr. Prime Minister, please ensure that Radio Canada International continues to exist. Make sure that it's integrated with other elements of our foreign policy, the Global Affairs Canada, that the Canadian Heritage Minister understands the role that he plays in supporting Canada's role internationally with the Canada Council, with the CBC and RCI. It has to be a concerted effort, but with all government departments who have a presence internationally and who have a way of reaching the world with information about what's wonderful about this country and what needs to be understood by others.
Gaston Barban, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Gaston Barban is a former Canadian ambassador, and he is a longtime foreign diplomat and was a liaison between Radio Canada International and the Foreign Affairs Department.